Okay, Jason. Hi. Thank you for coming to Ukraine. But why did you come in the midst of the war? Why did you come to Kyiv and why did you come to teach?
Thank you, Tymofiy, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be with Ukraine and at Kyiv School of Economics. So I asked to come, first of all, because I'm an anti-fascist and an anti-imperialist, and just like in the Spanish Civil War, leftists, anti-imperialists, anti-fascists showed up. So I'm showing up because if you can't help against a fascist Russian Empire and Vladimir Putin, the most clearly fascist leader since the Second World War, you have no business calling yourself an anti-fascist. So there's that. It was just my duty to come. I don't feel that it was brave to come because the Ukrainian armed forces, their sacrifices have kept Kyiv safe. So it's completely safe. The only annoying thing was the journey.
The journey.
Yeah, but also I work on fascism and I work on colonialism. These are topics I work on, and it's an existential moment for Ukraine. And I don't want to make other people's suffering into my theoretical work. However, to be in this moment with an anti-colonial, anti-fascist struggle and see this time when a nation, a new democratic nation is fighting for its survival, and to work with people and to learn from Ukrainians. I've been learning in my class from your students, and I've learned so much. I'm putting out there the frame that I understand, and I'm learning from them about their self-understanding. And so that's a unique opportunity.
So is it in a sense personal, or you wouldn't say it? I wouldn't put it that way.
I'm a philosopher, so it's for a philosopher to be there at an existential moment for democracy is a remarkable thing. And it's personal because I want my children to live in a better world. And this is, it's cliche to say at this point, but this is a front line against fascism and a front line for democracy. So it would be hypocritical for me to tell my children I'm an anti-fascist and I'm an anti-imperialist, but I'm going to stay in the United States. And that's one point. And the other point is just, you can theorize all you want, but unless you're experiencing it with people. I'm learning so much from our discussions in the class.
So what's the most striking disappointment in what you're learning from people? I'm on purpose not asking you what's the most exciting thing you've learned.
I expected this, but especially during this time, but it's complex for people to face their own complicated history. So I was in a t-shirt store. I was in a store today to buy some souvenirs for my children. And I saw a t-shirt with Stepan Bandera on it. And as a Jewish person, child of 2 Holocaust survivors, that's not something I want to see. I don't want to feel like I'm in a country that is connecting their struggle to Bandera for obvious reasons. But I haven't seen as much of that aspect. I've seen a kind of, I've seen with democracy, you need to be self-critical. You need a democratic spirit. And, I was warned, this is wartime. A democratic spirit is not for wartime. But this goes to what I'm pleased about. I have seen that self-critical spirit during wartime. But, there are also the elements that I worry about, which you would expect. People say they don't. I think it's healthy not to trust politicians, but if you only trust the military, that's dangerous for a democracy. So I have concerns. It's an existential time, so it's a difficult time for Ukraine. I've been mostly really impressed by the democratic spirit, the self-critical spirit. But sometimes people have been very defensive when I talk about the problematic aspects of the Ukrainian past.
One aspect that we picked up in the class was the discussion of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And people were saying that Ukrainians were forced
Right.
into the Soviet Union, and it's not their collective responsibility for the good and the bad that the Soviet Union has done. And we disagreed. Some people disagreed, saying that we have to face our past, and many Ukrainians were willing and able to commit things to, again, good and bad that the Soviet Union have done. And one of that, in my view, is Russification. And you have a book forthcoming on the language.
The politics of
Yeah,
language.
and it's forthcoming, I think, in Princeton University Press, right?
Yeah.
I have not read it yet, but I have pre-ordered it, so I'm gonna be looking. This issue is very intimate to me personally, and I think also to many people in Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian. My identity is Ukrainian, but Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, and many Russians, I fear a majority, would perceive me as a confused ethnic Russian. Because I was born speaking Russian, my parents identify as Russians, although upon further learning of the history as I grew up, I discovered that they have Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and all kinds of roots, but Russians. Still, it took me, 30, 40 years to switch to speak Ukrainian. Publicly, I started speaking Ukrainian in 2014. Privately, in my private life with my wife, only now. And then not always. We tend to slide right back into Russian. But I try. And many people say that it doesn't matter, that, we are free. It's actually oppressive. It's actually oppressive to deny or impose on people to speak Ukrainian. And I can't find the balance. I struggle with myself. Where's the right line? And on the one hand, I think we have been colonized, so we have to be decolonized, and therefore we have to learn Ukrainian and we have to speak Ukrainian. On the other hand, it goes against the very, the concern you have about freedom. Shouldn't be people allowed to speak whatever they want if it's Russian? So we have been colonized. We are speaking Russian. So what? That's past. Now that's people's language.
You should definitely not force people to speak Ukrainian.
Okay.
It's nevertheless important to preserve Ukrainian and to teach speak Ukrainian in schools and in public places. You shouldn't force people to do anything other than not hurt people. So you could probably force them to pay taxes too. That's fine.
And sometimes in Ukraine, that's
Right.
even that is questionable.
Right. But no, you can't force people to speak a language. They can speak whatever language they want. However, that's different from having schools where you speak Ukrainian, making sure that people read Shevchenko and other Ukrainian writers, and preserve the Ukrainian language as the official language.
But isn't that forcing?
No, it's not forcing, because people can speak Russian, people can speak English. I've been speaking English here. So let me say why it's important to have Ukrainian be the official language and Ukrainian perspective be the perspective in the schools. Because a language is a culture. So a word, what is a word? A word is individuated by a speech practice. It's because a word, when I say dog, it refers to dogs because it's in a speech practice that we hand down in a community that makes it refer to dog. It could have referred to cats, but that's not the speech practice that makes that word what it is. But there's lots of other aspects of the speech practice that give the word meaning. A word has a certain resonance with an emotion or a value. I use the term colonialism because it's a negative value. A people's history is connected to the values they assign to events. So, think of the feeling that Ukrainians have when they hear Putin. They think very negatively. Or Russia right now, they think negatively. Or, or the Ukrainian independence, 1991 Ukrainian independence, they think positively. So those are values that are connected with language, with ways of speaking, ways of describing the world. And a language is a collection of practices, just like a religion is a collection of practices. And when you're asked to speak someone else's language, it's someone else's set of practices, someone else's experiences, someone else's history. Now, you can change that history. You can work in that language to change the meanings and try to make it your own. But why should you? Your language reflects the practices, the way the words in your language reflect this history. And they have emotion, a word connected to, like airplane here has a powerful resonance because of the largest airplane in the world destroyed. It worship here means something. It brings a feeling of patriotism. In English, the word worship doesn't bring a feeling of patriotism. So if you're forced to speak Russian and you use the word worship, it doesn't have the same resonance. And so losing your language is losing your history.
So, so many questions, but I'm trying to structure them. One is, in the beginning of annexation of 2014, there was this push that in Ukraine to speak Ukrainian. And some people objected and said we shouldn't allow Russia to appropriate the Russian language.
Yeah.
So aren't we somehow endorsing their colonialism when we are saying Russian belongs and all the culture and positive aspects of that culture, those which happened in Ukraine too, belong now to Russia under the name of Russian language and culture, whereas we carry the other practice?
So brilliant. This is what we've been discussing in class, in the last two classes, when we read Gugi Wathiongo's book, Decolonizing the Mind. So he begins that book by talking about African literature and saying African literature had only been ever written in the colonizers' languages. English, Chinua Achebe and Gugi Wathiongo both wrote in English, very famous novels. Chinua Achebe won the Nobel Prize writing in English. And so Gugi Wathiongo, when he wrote Decolonizing the Mind, it was his last English book. From then on, he only wrote in Kikuyu, his native language. And he begins the book by saying, if we write by talking about African writers like Chinua Achebe and others who said what you did, saying, we're changing the English language. We're bringing in African proverbs. We're bringing in African culture into the English language. Gugi Wathiongo says several things. First of all, he says, why should we help the colonizers? Why should we enrich their language? Number one. Number two, he said, it makes the concept of African literature incoherent. He says, what if you have a European writing in an African language? Is that African literature? What if you have an African writing in Arabic? Is that African literature? What if you have an African writing in English about living in Greenland, about Greenland? Is that African literature? What if you have, so all of these questions show that if you want to have a conception of Ukrainian literature that's written in Russian, not clear what that is. It might be totally incoherent. Gugi Wathiongo is saying it's incoherent. What if you have a Ukrainian writing in Russia about living in Moscow?
But what to do with what has already happened? Because so much Ukrainian culture has been Russified.
Right.
And values in that part of culture, some people would say, are very different from what we are seeing coming from the Kremlin or from mainstream.
It's the same as with African literature, right? The same questions. The same, all of African literature until recently, the last few decades, was written in English or French. So they face the same exact issue. Are you going to give up Chinua Achebe? He won the Nobel Prize. The Nadine Gordi, you have these writers, African writers, who wrote in English, and they wrote great novels about Africa. However, I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o is right, that at a certain point, you stop.
You stop.
You stop.
With that, I agree. And now, if you stop, in my daily private life, in practice, or in society, how do I decolonize myself? Because I worry, and what I perceive is that I still bring Russian concepts, or sometimes even Soviet Union concepts, in terms of jokes, anecdotal stories. Yeah, now they sound in Ukraine, but those are also, it's the reverse part of it.
Exactly.
They are not really Ukrainian.
Right. Just
and
like
I'm
Ukraine.
bringing them into Ukrainian language. Should I, I don't want to bring Russian culture in Ukrainian language. How do I decolonize myself while transiting, while moving forward?
Well, I think cultures change. So I think it would be wrong to de-Russify yourself, because Ukraine and what Ukraine is has been affected by that time. So if you try to remove that time, you're actually removing Ukrainian history. It is part of Ukrainian history to have been part of the Soviet Union. To go back to your earlier point about collective responsibility, many Ukrainians were proud Soviet citizens.
Yes.
Ukrainians helped defeat the Nazis. So.
But also helped to do Gulag, and were one of the most largest, or at least very well represented part of people in Gulag.
I think
both
sides,
both right?
sides. That's right. And Ukrainians helped the Nazis. Some Ukrainians.
That's true.
So there's all of our.
Even now we have Ukrainians who are willingly given coordinates of schools and hospitals to Russians.
Right, exactly. That's common in colonial situations where members of a colonized population are taken over, are collaborators, and they're usually the worst, the worst actors. We were talking today about what happened in the Mau Mau, in my class, about what happened in Mau Mau in Kenya, when some of the worst, most brutal people were the British loyalists among the Kikuyu. Idi Amin was in the King's Armed Rifles. That's where he learned, working in Kikuyu concentration camps. He was Ugandan, of course, but his brutality derives from that. So when you sell out your own people and work for the colonizer, it has a terrible effect on you. So we know that from history. So I think it would be a mistake to remove the Russian phrases from one's language, unless Ukraine decides collectively to do that, and you make that other shift. Because for me, as I've learned from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but it's also the theory that I argue for with my co-author David Beaver in my book, which is, for me, a language reflects its history. And Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and so it has that history. And to erase that history would be to erase part of history. And so, Russia wants to erase your history. So
we shouldn't be helping them.
We shouldn't be helping them, exactly. So by erasing Ukraine's time in the Soviet Union, you're erasing your own history, and you're doing no favors to your children and grandchildren.
So earlier you said that there was a personal reason for you, but you just talked about yourself. The personal reason for you to talk in Ukraine, to teach in Ukraine, to visit Ukraine. What about your family? Is there any connection? Is this personality connection is coming from the history of your family, or from something what happened to your family?
Good. So yes, I mean, both my parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother is from Chelm, and she survived in the Gulag before she was returned. She returned to Poland. My father is from Berlin, who was 7. He fled Berlin in 1939 when he was 7. And so they experienced genocide. So in the first instance, it's what Ukraine faces, genocide, a kind of, not a sort of planned starvation genocide, but an actual genocide of killing everyone, destroying the buildings, wiping Ukrainian identity off the map. So that when I look at Russian propaganda about Ukraine, it looks a lot like Nazi propaganda about Jews. And so for me, that struck a chord. Like, the Nazis actually thought of Ukrainians as natural slaves. They didn't think of them as they thought of Jews. They thought of Ukrainians as laborers, as people they can put into slave labor, like under slavery, Black Americans were treated. But now the Russian fascism, treats Ukrainians like Nazis treated Jews. It says they're an existential threat to Russia. Nazis said there can be no living Jews, because as long as there are living Jews, we Aryans are in danger. That's what the Russians are saying about Ukrainians. So it immediately set off alarm bells as a child of Holocaust survivors. I feel when there's a genocide that is threatened, I need to do what I can, whatever little I can, to warn about that. And I feel that that message needs to be emphasized. Like, some people outside Ukraine say Ukraine should make territorial concessions. I don't think Ukraine should or can make territorial concessions, because you wouldn't leave Warsaw under Hitler. That would be crazy. You know.
But that's not how the world views it, right? It's for the world. I still hear that it's your regional war. It's some people still use the language, your brothers, your comrades. You have to find a way to go back, in the same bed, and this is just a civil war.
Well, if you listen to Russian propaganda, you will realize that you cannot leave any part of Ukraine in Russian hands unless they change their attitude. Right now, their attitude is genocidal. So let me say something else about Ukraine. I went to Babyn Yar yesterday, and under the urging of Ukrainian politicians and friends of mine, said you have to go. I grew up hearing about Babyn Yar. All Jews hear about Babyn Yar from a very young age. It's existential horror for us. 2 days, 33,000 people killed. It's existential horror because Ukraine means so much for Jews. It's one of our two homes. Poland and Ukraine are, where most Jews come from. And and it was an event that was so quick. And there was Ukrainian complicity, because the Nazis, like the Russians today, always have collaborators in their country. So growing up, I had heard that Ukraine, the Soviet Union, its version of anti-Semitism was never to mention the Holocaust. So they'd have a memorial in Babyn Yar that doesn't mention Jews. And we had heard Ukraine, that Babyn Yar was not something that was central in Ukraine. And that's kind of horrifying, because it's a central site of the Holocaust. And to have Babyn Yar be memorialized like that is very moving and important. It was moving and important to me. So I felt if Ukraine can do that, I should do what I can to help Ukraine in facing something.
So you
similar.
visited the site.
I visited the site.
And what are your impressions about the site and about the memorial?
I thought
what have you seen? Because most people actually might not have seen it or might not have.
It was remarkably well done. There's when you walk down the road that many Jews and Roma walked down before they were shot, there's loudspeakers that list the names, an endless repetition of the names of the people who were murdered. There's a large memorial on a field where there are columns with bullet holes using all the exact bullets that were used to murder people, murder so many.
So they actually got the bullets out of the ground.
Exactly. They got the bullets out of the ground, and they shot them into the holes, so you could see the wounds the shape of the wounds that must have been on people's bodies. And throughout, you're hearing this music that's created from the 100,000 names of people that they've found. So you realize that there's this enormous memory project of retrieving the names of these people. Then Marina Abramovich did this very moving The Crying Wall that worked with me. And so, you know, I found some aspects disturbing. Like I saw Ukrainians, I don't know if they're Ukrainians, I saw people walking their dogs and clearly misusing the site, which happens a lot. But it was a park before, which is a typical way that you erase memory. You
planned over, you know, you destroy churches, cemeteries.
You put a park over them, so then people's
Or
memory.
places of crime and
Exactly.
prisons, gulags, and you put parks over them.
Exactly. So people remember, oh, that's where I had a barbecue,
yes.
Rather than. So in the South, in America, in Alabama, the ironworks, where the slave ironworks, where enslaved Black Americans were forced to work, one of the most terrible sites in America because it was brutal work. They put a park over it, you know.
That's how you erase memory.
That's how you erase memory.
You put parks over.
Yeah.
You're seemingly doing good,
yeah.
public good. You're
exactly.
creating places of help to people, but in fact you're erasing memory.
Exactly. So I thought the Babin Yar Memorial, especially, you know, the work they did in finding the names and creating the names of the people killed. And then there was a very moving memorial to Bakhmut. First of all, they showed you what happened in Bakhmut during World War II, where they took 3,000 Jews and put them in a mine and walled up the mine, so they died over days. And all the Jews of Bakhmut. And then they show you Bakhmut today, and there's a film that shows you Bakhmut in World War II, Bakhmut done by the son of one of the Nazis, Bakhmut in World War II, Bakhmut in 2021, and then Bakhmut today, showing you that you know, the few buildings the Nazis left standing, the Russians have destroyed.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So how does what's the structure, what's the process which makes this genocidal attitude, fascist attitude, industrial? Because it doesn't take, you know, we have this discussion that some people are saying, you know, this is just the Kremlin or Putin, but there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people actively involved in executing the strategy of the Kremlin today, in killing these people. Someone is pressing a button in a tank, shooting at a civilian building. Yeah. Someone is shooting a machine gun at a car trying to evacuate.
Yeah, so the 20th century and now the 21st century has been brutal for this, right? We've seen so many genocides, and we're seeing one again here. So, you know, there's Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, about the Wehrmacht. You know, Himmler thought that Germans would never be able to do it.
And now the alarm is going up, the siren, the missile alert is going up.
Right. Missile alert, again and again, the missiles, you know.
But so we'll continue and see if it gets closer, we'll be pushed into the shelter, you know.
Yeah.
So they're going to monitor the channels and see.
Yeah, I've been teaching in the shelter several times.
Yes.
So
yeah, it's just announcement of the. Okay.
Yeah.
But let's keep doing it, and if something. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So Christopher Browning's book Ordinary Men is about how the Wehrmacht.
Sorry, it's ordinary men right now have pressed some buttons.
Exactly. So we know. I mean, Germany. You know, people talk about Russia having high culture. Germany was the most cultured, educated country in the world. And they killed how many? 5 million Ukrainians? 5 to 6 million Ukrainians. So these were ordinary men, ordinary, educated men. All 6 of my great aunts and uncles and all of their children were shot over pits in eastern Poland by ordinary men. And we're seeing it again. And we know with the Russians, we know what they did in Syria. They killed 48,000 civilians in Aleppo. You know, they've been practicing for this, the Second Chechen War. You know, the Russian army, Putin has been practicing genocide now for a long time.
How do you turn a person, a human, into an ordinary man who practices genocide?
This is one of the biggest, to me, this is one of the biggest questions, philosophical questions of our current moment. It's because the easy answer is you dehumanize them.
Yes, I've heard that
And it's
about torture chambers, how
Yeah.
the guys from FSB families, top-notch education, wealthy, very pedantic, come to Kherson and cut off hands.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's dehumanization. I think they know the people are humans, because who cuts off the hand or tortures a dog? No one. There's no genocide. I mean, there are the livestock and the that is dehumanization with chickens, in factory farming. But it's not chickens and factory farming that's going on in Kherson. They know that these are humans. And that's why they're torturing them. It's not cannibalism. They're not going to eat them. It's not dehumanization. It's because they're human that they're doing this. So dehumanization is the wrong term. It's the wrong concept. So what makes it that we can do such horror to other people? And we must recognize that all of us have this capacity. I don't have an answer to that. We need to have an answer to that, because now that we have, it is colonization, the practices of colonization involve this. I think one part of it is when you believe that a group of people should be subordinate to you, when you believe that a group of people are naturally below you and they're rebelling.
But now you're talking about colonialization, but you made a distinction in class and elsewhere between fascism, that Russia is fascist, whereas, let's say, the Soviet Union and Tsarist Russia, they were more of empires and they were colonizing Ukraine. So what is actually the difference?
So multiple regime types engage in colonization. What we've been discovering in class is that the practices of colonization are very similar. And I think that the way I think of it is that colonization, and this is the way M.A. Césaire presents it, colonization corrupts a nation's soul. Because when you colonize another country, you're fascist to them. You impose fascism on them. And now you can be like Belgium. Belgium, King Leopold II killed 10 million Congolese. And they cut off the hands of little children. There's all these pictures of little 5-year-olds with their missing hands. They all to get rubber. They would cut off the hands of children in a tribe if the tribe didn't bring them enough rubber. And so 10 million. And the Belgians aren't fascist, but Belgian wealth is based on one of history's worst crimes. So they imposed a kind of Auschwitz on Congolese, a kind of mixture of Auschwitz and the Gulag, because it was about labor. And so colonialism involves treating a population in a fascist way. But you can still preserve your own non-fascist regime. But what M.A. Césaire says is that very often those fascist practices will come home to you.
And that's what's happening in Russia, in your view?
What's happening in Russia is it's a long-standing imperialist country, and those brutal practices, like the Chechen wars of the 1990s, are coming home. And so, Russia itself faces, opposition figures in Russia face terrible treatment from Russia. So Russia's a fascist country.
Navalny has just been given another term. And if he serves that term, he'll come out when he's 74 years old.
Yeah.
And the conditions of the term are in isolation, no ability to speak to others, first 10 years without meetings.
Horrible. I mean, it's horrific. Right. So Russia is a fascist country. Russia is a fascist country, and it gets its population used to fascism by sending them out to commit horrible crimes in other countries.
But the Soviet Union didn't do that?
Soviet Union did, but the Soviet Union did.
What's the distinction
right.
then between the two?
Because the Soviet Union hid its fascism under a cloak of social justice. So just like the United States hid its brutal treatment of black people under the cloak of democracy. So the United States now has the world's largest prison system. So 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States. So we have in the United, so these, both the Soviet Union and the United States hid brutality, Soviet Union more so, hid brutality behind these cloaks of social justice. And so Russia's not pretending anymore at all.
Yeah.
So, and the pretense turns out to be important because the pretense stops you from doing the worst things.
The worst things.
Exactly.
Yeah, there are some limits on that.
There's some limits on that.
And they don't have the limits
There's
anymore.
no more limits.
So we talked earlier, informally, before this meeting, about the fact that, and also in the class, you were talking about us having two wars. One war is on the battlefield, and the other outside of it. What did you mean?
So Putin's justification, what he said about why he was invading Ukraine, is that Ukraine is fascist. And what he was drawing upon was, say, the Ukrainian nationalists in World War II who sided with Hitler, kind of bad, dangerous version of fascism. A version of nationalism, a version of nationalism that erases history, that says we are always great, that is against national minorities. Ukraine, that version of nationalism has not emerged. Ukraine is it's one of the only countries in the region that doesn't have a powerful far right political
That's
party.
actually, that's actually is very puzzling for me, being in Ukraine, or maybe I'm oblivious, but at the same time, this argument about Nazis by Putin, it gets traction in the US, it gets traction in Europe,
Right.
Or maybe it's marginal traction, but what's the evidence? I mean, I understand the
past.
The past.
Yeah, the Bandera T-shirts in the stores don't help, but the past is the evidence. That it's not evidence; it's just the past. And so just like if somebody said the United States was filled with the Ku Klux Klan,
It was racist. Yeah,
right. I mean, the United States is still racist, but it's not as bad as it was. So, but I think Ukraine has progressed even further. Ukraine is, it's not an anti-Semitic country here. Your relationship to your national minorities is better. You don't have a Donald Trump. So,
it doesn't track in politics, but we have elements of racism, or at least, no, I don't want to protect, but I think people are ignorant about some of this.
Sure, because it's not really a multicultural. It doesn't have a lot of non-white people.
I'm kind of going sideways. We'll come back in a second. But do you think after the war, Ukraine has a chance to become multicultural by immigration? Can we ever, or is it just takes decades? Or?
I think immigration is very important for Ukraine because Ukraine it protects against the kind of pernicious or dangerous nationalism that Putin accuses Ukraine of having. So what I mean by the two wars is Putin wants to say Ukraine is fascist, meaning that the basis of Ukrainian nationalism is this kind of fascist nationalism, the kind of sort of Romanian nationalism in World War II, Ukrainian nationalists in World War II who allied with National Socialism. Wars have a terrible effect on countries. They're very difficult for countries. And the concern is that an autocratic, anti-democratic version of Ukraine will emerge out of the war.
How could it happen? Isn't Ukraine the notion, okay, young, I call it teenage, but democracy, that at every turn Ukraine has taken the right, decision with Yanukovych, with in 2004, in 1991 during the independence decision, in 2004 during the rigged elections for pro-Russian Yanukovych, 2014, and then 2022.
I agree with this 100%. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. However, I think it's unlikely. But if Ukraine does reject democracy, goes with an autocratic leader, say, or the military is obviously heroic now, but the military shouldn't run the country. If Ukraine were to go that way, or a version of Ukrainian nationalism that's hostile to foreigners developed, or violent to national minorities like Ukrainians who are Crimean Tatars, if that emerges from this, then Russia wins. Russia wins the battle off the battleground, the war off the battleground, off the front lines, if Ukraine becomes the kind of country that Putin falsely says it is. Now, I think you're right that Ukraine is connected to democracy, that the democratic self-identity is a weapon. The fact that, Ukrainians at a very basic level want to replace their leaders in elections.
Not only, all the time.
All the time. All the time.
The moment I experienced, I know so many people who have experienced, you could be friends with the civil society. The moment you're in the office, you're the enemy from the day one.
Right. So that's actually kind of useful.
It is.
That democratic spirit. Nobody wants a Lukashenko here. Nobody. Mm-hmm. And so it's a powerful democratic spirit. So I'm optimistic. However, anti-immigrant, those sentiments, the ethno-nationalism that of a Bandera, say, the ethno-nationalism that Putin wants to say is in Ukraine, cannot develop.
What are the structural elements? What are the steps? What are the symptoms of things like that happen? How did Lukashenko or Putin have become so powerful? And where did the society miss it? What's the tipping point?
When people connect with the autocratic leader and think he's the only honest one, he represents us, and the politicians are a corrupt group that are not serving as checks and as a check on his power, but preventing a pure relationship between the leader and his people. Mm-hmm. And so the reason you have a parliament, a president, and courts is so they can each check each other. So no one has full power. An autocratic president says, look, I represent your interests. I am you. And so the politicians that interfere with me, you should get rid of them. So you should reduce them in power or, get rid of them. You should make them just lackeys or followers of me. And then we can have a pure relationship. They represent democracy as corrupt, and they represent themselves as honest and authentic and the pure voice of the people.
But isn't sometimes that politicians are truly corrupt? And isn't sometimes, there are ideas that, direct democracy could be more efficient, where people just elect the leader and then the leader has the power until the next next elections?
Hitler says true German democracy is when there's only one leader and he makes all the decisions. So I don't really go with that. I thought direct democracy is when everyone votes by referendum on the issues, and there's no leader. I see. So direct democracy would be no leaders at all. Yeah, that's the understanding. Just vote you decide together.
It's like Ramada meeting every time.
Exactly. So this idea of one leader who's not checked. The problem is that leader is almost always corrupt, right? Much more corrupt than any of the politicians. Look at Putin, look at Lukashenko, look at the Orban. Orban's children are his family is massively wealthy. His friends are also massively wealthy.
What to do if the politicians and courts indeed are corrupt?
It's never going to be, you always...
Easy, I agree with that. So it's all, I'm not trying to make it, kind of challenging and trivial. I'm asking,
Right.
good faith question, because in practice, when the society goes through this transformation, there is corruption in many, many.
Yeah. One thing I found in my research for my book, How Fascism Works, is that every fascist politician, because fascism always usually comes into power through democratic elections, they always run anti-corruption campaigns. So you have to be very careful. Putin ran an anti-corruption campaign in 2011.
China kills for corruption, presumably, right? There's capital punishment.
Well, but I'm making a different point. I'm making the point that you have to be a little careful of the desire to, you have to wipe out corruption, but you have to be very careful of leaders who say, I'm going to be the one who's going to wipe out corruption. Because look at Trump. Trump ran an anti-corruption campaign. Putin ran an anti-corruption campaign. These are incredibly corrupt politicians. But that said, what this means is in a democracy, the politicians have to be not corrupt. Because as soon as they're a little bit corrupt, a fascist leader can come and say they're corrupt, elect me.
And you also talked, that brings a connection in my mind, you also talked in one of your classes about the importance to speak truth to power in democracy as a culture of truth. Yeah. That you cannot have the culture of demagoguery where people say, oh, a liar, very funny, everyone was stupid, that they didn't realize what the truth was, how stupid could you be? So why the truth is important?
The truth is important because a democracy involves, central to a democracy is political equality.
What do you mean by political equality?
Exactly. Political equality can only mean the capacity to speak truth to power. So political equality has to be, is when a poor journalist can write an article about a politician showing that he's lying, that politician is lying, and that politician loses power because of it. Because that's a culture of...
If a politician is lying, a poor, unknown,
they become unpopular.
So they become unpopular, and the consequences, they lose office for lying, not for actions, but just for lying.
Yes, because that's what political equality is. They're caught lying, or they're caught being corrupt, lying for money, and that means they lose power, because that's speaking truth to power. That's a culture of accountability, a culture of truth. And so what you need in a democracy is a culture of accountability. And so otherwise you can't hold your politicians to account. So that's why powerful people try to erase a culture of accountability. They try to make it so that if you're caught lying, it doesn't matter. Everyone's like, you got away with it. That's great. So
smart guy.
Smart guy, exactly. And then there's only power.
So can we wrap up by talking very briefly about corruption? It's not immediately what you speak in the class, but that's a background theme which is in the West, and also, in fact, in Putin's speeches about Ukraine.
Yeah.
In his February 20, I think, in 22, 2 days before the invasion speech, he was talking about the fact that our politicians are corrupt, and our government and political elites do not represent people anymore because they are for sale.
Right.
And he uses this to justify this argument or case that there's no legitimacy to the government, and therefore it's not a state, therefore he can invade. But in the West, I also hear very similar arguments saying that, Ukraine is a corrupt country, that's the end of conversation. And I feel that it has become a little bit like, these phrases which shut down the conversation. The moment we say Ukraine is corrupt, the audience is split in two. One says, yes, there's nothing to do with Ukraine, let's abandon it. The other one says, no, but. But there's no actually real conversation about what corruption means, where is it pertinent, where it's prevalent. It's just corrupt or not, 0-1.
So what I found in my research is that the most corrupt politicians always accuse other people of corruption. As I said, Putin, Trump, both always run anti-corruption campaigns. The Republicans today are saying Joe Biden is corrupt, so we need Donald Trump. Putin is the most corrupt politician of the 21st century. He's accusing Ukraine of being corrupt, really? So he's the most fascist politician since World War II. He's accusing Ukraine of being fascist, really? So this charge of corruption, however, has incredible power politically. This is one thing I've noticed in my research. Every time you have an incredibly corrupt politician, every time you have a fascist politician, they accuse the democracy of being corrupt. Because a democracy is a mess. It involves a lot of people having to answer a lot of different interests. And so it looks corrupt. It looks, I have to make you happy and make you happy. So it's not
some rents going this way, some distortions in regulatory framework, some polls, some decisions.
Exactly, because you've got to win.
You're
balancing them out. Whereas an autocratic leader just says, this is how it's going to be. And so that seems not corrupt. So corruption, democracies are always accused of corruption by would-be autocratic leaders who then want to come and say, see, it's not corrupt. It's just what I say.
So how do we have a conversation about corruption, taking that into account within the society? Because I don't want to walk out from this saying that we're exonerated from corruption because it's Trump and no, we know our past. We're actually very open to that part of our past. We know our present. There are issues. They probably have become much better. There's progress on anti-corruption in Ukraine. But how do we have? But it's still there. The degree is probably 1/100 of what it was under Yanukovych.
Right.
But how do we have a conversation about this without Putin fall into the trap of black and white discussions?
Yeah, the United States is very corrupt. I mean, Trump, is always, he bought a hotel in Washington and everybody stayed in it, thereby contributing to Trump when he was president. I mean, and that's just one of a billion examples of what Trump did. But the United States is generally just corrupt. The thing is, politicians have to realize that when they're caught being corrupt, trying to enrich themselves, it threatens democracy. It's a threat to democracy.
So if we see a local Hromada and a bunch of Bentleys parked in front of the council, these guys have to be voted out.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Vote them out. and we should, it's healthy to have that attitude.
I wanted to talk about fascism and colonialism, and thank you very much. But we strayed away to everything, to including corruption and humanity and Babi Yar and memory. Yes. I think they're all connected, and thank you very much for being in Ukraine, for coming to teach here and speaking to people and posing questions.
Well, it's me that has to thank you, because you gave me the opportunity to come here. You set things up so I could have these conversations with you and with your students, with politicians, journalists, and students. I wanted to have these conversations to understand what this existential moment is creating for Ukraine as a people. So I've learned so much, and I really owe you.
Thank you very much.